Power, live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance Power. Alongside Michael Shepard, I'm Tyler Kendall.
Tonight, Jerome Powell leaves the door open to rate cuts, but is it enough to quiet the president's pressure campaign?
Jay Powell today said he suggested that they might cut interest rates, but they haven't proceeded.
Well, we call him too late for a reason. He should have cut him a year ago. He's too late.
We'll bring you some of the Federal Reserve Chairman remarks that sent stocks and bonds surging, and a fresh reaction from Jackson Hole when former Kansas City Fed President Esther George joins us.
Plus, developments from the White House regarding embattled chipmaker Intel. The president saying the company has agreed to give the government an about 10% equity stake in the company. We'll have more on that potential deal live from the White House.
And the big news from Canada tonight. America's second largest trading partner saying it will remove its retaliatory tariffs on a long list of U.S. products. Prime Minister Mark Carney announcing the decision a short time ago. Why and why now? When Dominic LeBlanc, the minister responsible for Canada-U.S. trade, joins us up ahead.
But we begin tonight with Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell's remarks today from the Jackson Hole Economic Policy Symposium. He discussed the possibility for the central bank to adjust its policy stance following recent data.
The stability of the unemployment rate and other labor market measures allows us to proceed carefully as we consider changes to our policy stance. Nonetheless, with policy in restrictive territory, the baseline outlook and the shifting balance of risks may warrant adjusting our policy stance.
And joining us now for more live from Jackson Hole, Wyoming, following Fed Chair Powell's remarks is, of course, Bloomberg's Michael McKee. Mike, thanks for being here. Can you just give us a recap? What sort of details did we really glean from the Fed Chair today when it comes to the future path of monetary policy?
Well, you notice he qualified it in that statement, saying it may be time to adjust our rate. But the markets don't do nuance, and they read that as we are going to cut rates on September 17th. And that's why you're getting the reaction that you got. Going into this, people thought he would be a little more cautious and try to hedge his bets some, because you've got two things going on. You've got the labor market weakening, at least in the last report, and that would require one kind of monetary policy response. You've got inflation picking up because tariffs are starting to work their way into the price chain, and that would require another Federal Reserve type of response. Today, what the chairman said was, we think it will be a faster reaction in the labor market to the president's fiscal policies than it will be in inflation. Inflation will take a little longer to show up because it has to go sector by sector, company by company, and country by country, given that there are all kinds of different tariff rates the president has put on it. And so they think the immediate danger is more in the labor market. Now, we'll have to see what happens when we get the next payrolls report on September 5th, and when we get the next CPI report on September 11th. But for right now, it looks like they're poised to cut rates.
Bloomberg's Michael McKee, thank you. And this afternoon, reports circulated that President Donald Trump will be meeting with the Intel CEO at the White House today. This comes just moments after the president announced that the chip maker had agreed to give the U.S. a 10% stake in the company. Take a listen.
You know what? I think the United States should be given 10% of Intel. And he said, I would consider that. I said, well, I'd like you to do that because Intel has been left behind.
Joining us now with the latest from President Donald Trump's announcement today is Bloomberg's Skylar Woodhouse, who is with us from the White House North Lawn. Skylar, we've gotten some more details on what this deal is looking like. Can you go through them? And can you also lay out a little bit about how the president described the way this deal came about?
Absolutely. This is really President Trump's sort of latest move in, bringing manufacturing back to the U.S. and sort of setting, the precedent that the U.S. is this, dominant global partner. He has said from, since taking office that the U.S. Is sort of going to, set its mark on the world. And this is what we're seeing right now with with Intel and the U.S. taking a 10% stake in the American company, it's really stunning just the way the U.S. has sort of intervened in this this tech company. So we'll have to see, sort of as the details come out, what this looks like. But right now, it's what we've received from the meeting today with President Trump meeting with the Intel CEO is that the U.S. will get 9.9% in fully diluted common shares. So we'll see, when this all takes effect. But, this is really the next step in sort of President Trump, leaning into American dominance and statecraft.
And Skylar, the other, of course, top story that we've been following today is the White House's pressure campaign on the central bank. And President Trump actually escalated his threats against Fed Governor Lisa Cook earlier today. Let's take a listen to what he had to say.
President Trump, you're going to fire Lisa Cook, the Fed governor, over her mortgage fraud?
I'll fire her if she doesn't resign, yeah. What she did was bad, so I'll fire her if she doesn't resign.
Now, Skylar, we should say and give the context here that President Trump is elevating these allegations of mortgage fraud against the Fed Governor Lisa Cook. But at this point, that's what they are. They're just allegations. No formal charges have been filed against Cook. But what do we know about potentially the legal basis here that President Trump might be considering? And what does this tell us about the White House's strategy when it comes to its pressure on the central bank?
President Trump, he is looking to, win the majority across the Fed board. So obviously, if he's able to remove Fed Governor Lisa Cook, whether that is with her resigning on her own merit or firing her, should she step aside, that gives Trump the opportunity to sort of bring in his own governor to take majority of the board. And that is what he's looking to do. Obviously, what we've seen from President Trump, since taking office in January are the repeated attacks on Fed Chair Jerome Powell. So this is really just the next step in sort of him, continuing his war against the Fed. And, only time President Trump today did not say how long he would give Fed Governor Lisa Cook to sort of evaluate if she would resign, but that is something we're closely watching to see when she resigns or when the president might intervene with an actual firing.
Right, exactly. A very high legal bar there if President Trump were to do so. Bloomberg's Skylar Woodhouse, we thank you so much for your reporting, as always. And for more insight into Fed Chair Powell's remarks today, as well as President Trump's latest pressure on the central bank, I'm pleased to say we're joined now by Esther George, the former president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City. She's live with us from Jackson Hole, Wyoming. President George, thank you so much for being here. And I want to pick up on this conversation when it does come to the White House's pressure campaign on the Federal Reserve. Do you think that there is risk here to Fed credibility if and when the Fed does cut rates?
Well, that's always the concern, because the Fed has been designed to be insulated from political pressure, and the more that pressure comes to bear, it begins to create sort of a cloud over their decision-making for the public. I think that is not true for the individuals around the table. They are quite focused on their responsibilities to the American public. But, of course, the communication that runs into this issue can become more difficult.
President George, were you expecting to hear a little bit more, perhaps, from Jerome Powell in defense of central bank independence, given that this is, in essence, his valedictory speech at Jackson Hole?
Yeah, I wasn't surprised. I mean, I'm not sure what could be said at this point that hasn't already been said. And he has been very clear that he is focused on the job that was given to this committee. So talking about the economy, talking about the framework, which describes how the Fed goes about its business, I think was his way of saying we are sticking to the business at hand. And I think that was appropriate for him.
Well, let's pick up on that framework and what we learned today, because I do want to ask you about inflation concerns, because the Monetary Policy Framework Review was revised to emphasize maintaining 2% inflation expectations. But what can the Fed do if you were advising here to keep consumer expectations well anchored when we really haven't seen them deliver on that 2% target in recent memory?
Yeah, I think it's a pretty big issue right now for the Federal Reserve. And of course, you heard the chairman characterize the upside risk to inflation that exists. You heard his emphasis in the framework review that having well-anchored long-run inflation expectations would be critical for this committee to do its work. And so right now, depending on where you are looking for evidence of the anchoring of those inflation expectations, I think you have consumers feeling one way, you have businesses beginning to think about how the inflation pressures that lie ahead might be affecting them. And so I think it creates a tentative environment, if you will, about what the public expects inflation to be down the road. And that, of course, is going to be, I think, one of this committee's biggest challenges ahead, is that you have an inflation dynamic right now where inflation was already running well above the Fed's stated target, their definition of price stability. Now you have the tariff effects, which, again, the committee might be willing to look through, but it becomes pretty difficult to disentangle where some of those effects are coming from. So it is a time, I think, of really having to lean into where are the risks around this monetary policy.
President George, I wanted to dial into that question of tariffs and their impact on prices. And today, during his remarks, Jerome Powell did indicate that he saw it more as a fleeting impact on inflation rather than something that would be persistent. But he did not rule out the latter scenario entirely. What is your view about the risk down the road, especially given that the administration isn't done with the imposition of tariffs?
I think that's why this question becomes so difficult to answer. Because if tariffs were coming in one discrete move in a very precise amount, then you might feel more comfortable saying this is a one-time hit to the price level and we can look through that. But the truth is you now have inflation that is reacting to how these tariffs are being carried out. They're being carried out with a fair amount of discretion by country. Companies will be responding to those in different ways. And that's why I think it is going to be more difficult and, frankly, more challenging as the committee tries to keep its credibility, tries to keep that inflation expectation anchored, to know what is driving the impact of inflation here. So it just creates a lot of uncertainty, and I think you heard that today in the chairman's speech. This is being conducted in the context of significant uncertainty.
Significant uncertainty, and we also heard Fed Chair Jerome Powell talk about the idea of how tightening immigration policy is impacting the labor market. And I'm curious what you think about this idea as firms try to absorb some of the excess costs when it comes to tariffs and passing that on to consumers. Are they also going to be perhaps faced with some higher labor costs here, too, as we watch more of the administration's policies play out?
So I think this is also a very open question. The dynamics between these two are going to be worth watching, because you'll be watching for the wage impact as we see price effects come into play, and companies will have to make decisions here about whether their ability to pass on cost, to pay workers, all of that mix is going to be very important in how the Fed judges what its next steps are going forward. So yes, those two are very tightly linked, I think, when it comes to trying to decipher the economy. And you heard the chairman say today, the labor market is reacting to both supply and demand factors right now, which make, and I think he used the word, a curious mix to come up with the current unemployment rate. So it is a time of uncertainty, and understanding the dynamics that are affecting both the price inflation as well as labor rates is going to be an important one for them to decipher.
Esther George, former Kansas City Fed president, thank you so much. Coming up, Volodymyr Zelensky says only President Trump can stop Vladimir Putin as details of potential peace talks remain unclear. We'll discuss with Evelyn Farkas of the McKee Institute up ahead. But first, Canada says that they will remove retaliatory tariffs on U.S. products in an olive branch move to Donald Trump. We'll discuss this with Dominic LeBlanc, Minister for Canada-U.S. Trade, next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio.
removing his tariffs, yeah.
Exactly.
He's removing his retaliatory tariffs, which I thought was nice. And we're going to have another call soon. Okay. Yeah, we had a very good call.
You're getting closer towards an agreement on trade?
I like them. You know, look, I'm fighting for the United States. Canada and Mexico have taken a lot of our business over the years, over 25, 30 years.
That was President Donald Trump earlier today discussing Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney's decision to remove retaliatory tariffs on U.S. products that comply with the USMCA deal in a move that appears to be an olive branch to the U.S. after months of trade negotiations. Joining us now with more insight is Dominic LeBlanc, President of the King's Privy Council for Canada and the Minister responsible for U.S.-Canada trade. Minister LeBlanc, thank you so much for joining us. We have to ask, this is coming across as something of an olive branch to the U.S., but what is Canada getting in return at this moment and then down the road from this gesture?
So thank you for the question. As the president said today, and as he said to the prime minister in his what we thought was a positive telephone conversation yesterday, if we're preparing for a review of the USMCA, of the trade agreement, which is built into the agreement in 2026, the Americans had in their tariffs respected imports into the United States that were compliant with the USMCA agreement. And we thought that it was appropriate and proper for Canada to assume a similar posture and therefore adjust the retaliatory tariffs that we had put in place in February and March to ensure that, like the administration in the United States, we're respecting those goods that are compliant with the USMCA. So we took down those retaliatory tariffs. And based on my conversations with Secretary Lutnick, the Prime Minister speaking with President Trump, we're optimistic that we can work with President Trump and his administration and come to an agreement that can be beneficial for the economy of both countries. There are so many things that we can do collaboratively. The economies are so integrated in strategic sectors important to the president. We think there's a lot of positive things that we can do. And this was an important step in terms of getting us to that conversation.
Well, I do want to drill down on this idea of strategic sectors and ask you about how negotiations are going when it comes to steel and aluminum tariffs, because 50% levy is, of course, a very high rate. Have you gotten any indications that that rate is going to come down?
No, not yet. We're optimistic. We're continuing to talk to Secretary Lutnick and others in the Ambassador Greer, others in the administration. But your question is a good one. The Section 232 tariffs on the strategic sectors, the president has applied with very little relief those tariffs globally, including in agreements that he signed with other trading partners as important as the European Union or the United Kingdom. So other major trading partners have not gotten much relief from those 232 sectoral tariffs. The difference with Canada is that those are precisely the sectors in which our economies are the most integrated. So if it's the automobile tariffs, the aluminum tariffs, softwood lumber is another example. For decades, we have integrated supply chains, just-in-time delivery. I've said before, Canada and the United States don't as much as sell things to each other, but build things together and sell them around the world. We've taken very, very tough measures, as has the United States, with respect to dumping from countries like China of steel and aluminum. So we're optimistic that we can continue to have those conversations with President Trump's administration and make the case that there's an economic opportunity for both countries if we reset some of those sectoral tariffs.
Minister LeBlanc, a number of other U.S. trading partners, including Japan and the European Union, have made investment pledges in the U.S. As a way of perhaps lowering the tariff burden that they might ultimately face from Washington. Is Canada considering making a similar commitment to invest in the U.S. The way that other trading partners have so far?
Those have absolutely been part of our conversations with President Trump's administration at many levels. Canada is already the second most important foreign direct investor in the U.S. economy. If you take just the pension funds in Canada. Just take that one example. There's 8 large pension funds that invest around the world. If you take the enterprise value of those investments, it's almost $1 trillion of investment in the United States economy. And that figure can grow $100 billion a year. Like there is, to answer your question very directly, there are numerous examples where Canadian private sector and quasi-public sector, in the case of pension funds, can invest in very important sectors to President Trump and to the U.S. economy. You could think of energy, you can think of mineral projects, but we can also invest in Canada and do things jointly, defense, security, just to offer 2 quick examples. Again, where Canada and the United States have always, and we are increasing as a Canadian government, our investments in those sectors. So therein lie huge opportunities for partnerships with the United States as well.
Minister, in the final minutes that we have with you, I want to ask you about this idea that Canada was really one of the only countries to retaliate against President Trump's tariff plans. And when you've seen the sort of more preferential rates that our other trading partners have been able to secure, in retrospect, would you have taken this same tact?
Sure, I think we would have. I think, as I say, that the circumstance of last February or March is different than the circumstance at the end of August. The U.S. administration has been clear in terms of the 232 sectoral tariffs. We've seen, to your question, examples of agreements they've signed with those countries that haven't provided much relief, if any, in the 232 sectoral tariffs. But as we said at the beginning, the fact that President Trump in his executive order at the end of July confirmed the American exemption that they're according to imports from Canada that are compliant with the USMCA, with the Free Trade Agreement, means that Canada should mirror that exemption, and that's the decision that Prime Minister Carney announced today. We believe in the USMCA. We believe it's in the interest of the Canadian and American economies and the Mexican economy as well, that we strengthen and commit ourselves to that agreement. President Trump did that with the carve-out that he provided Canada, which puts us at a marginal advantage to other countries. But we want to respect that commitment and ensure that we're also mirroring that decision that President Trump made.
All right. Dominic LeBlanc, President of the King's Privy Council for Canada and Minister responsible for Canada-U.S. trade. Thank you so much. Of course, Mike, this is a story that we watch very closely here at Bloomberg. And when you look at those other more preferential rates that other countries have been able to secure, we've been waiting for some sort of update when it comes to Canada.
And it's such an important trade relationship, and yet it's one that had really gone off the rails from the time that Donald Trump took office. They really have been at loggerheads and having difficulty in reaching this understanding. And maybe we have a path there, perhaps through investment.
Right. All right. We'll continue that conversation. But coming up first, a federal judge has ordered that Alligator Alcatraz must wind down operation. We'll bring you those details as well as the latest on the war with Ukraine. This is Bloomberg.
The baseline outlook and the shifting balance of risks may warrant adjusting our policy stance. Our policy rate is restrictive, modestly so in my view. The stability of the unemployment rate and other labor market measures allows us to proceed carefully. While the labor market appears to be in balance, it is a curious kind of balance. Longer-term inflation expectations, however, as reflected in market and survey-based measures, appear to remain well anchored. We will not allow a one-time increase in the price level to become an ongoing inflation problem.
That was Fed Chair Jerome Powell delivering his last speech at the Jackson Hole Economic Policy Symposium as the head of the central bank earlier today. His signals about a possible rate cut as soon as September were what Wall Street wanted to hear. And for more on that, we turn to Power Moves with Bloomberg's Vonnie Quinn, who joins us live from World Headquarters in New York. Vonnie, that really is the question. Are traders only hearing what they want to hear? Were there not any other somewhat hawkish notes in there that could be somehow divined?
Funny you should mention our own Anna Wong of Bloomberg Economics is pointing to that very phenomenon, right, Mike? She's actually saying that there were plenty of hawkish notes to this speech. There was a lot of talk about growth slowing, for example. There was a lot of talk about fragilities in the labour market that might just get worse. And, of course, the Fed chair also pointed to other scenarios, maybe not as base scenario, but other scenarios that could come to fruition, such as tariff effects having a longer-term impact on inflation or inflation expectations, which would really be something that the Fed would be worried about because it would impact the consumer greatly. That said, as you mentioned, markets took the signal for a September cut and ran with it, pricing in about a 90% chance now of a cut in September once again. Not a fully 100% of a chance, but definitely a 90% chance. And the major indexes were higher on the day. In fact, the Dow Jones Industrial Average had a record, its first record this year. It hadn't been this high since last December. Same for the S&P 500. It reversed all those days of declines, and we had the Nasdaq 100 ending positive on the week. Obviously, yields were where you saw the most reaction, and we had the two-year yield dropping nearly 11.5 basis points on the session. It was an incredible plummeting in the front end, which is, of course, the most sensitive part of the curve to whatever the Fed decides to do next. Traders obviously will be looking out to October and December, to the next Fed meetings now as well, and postulating perhaps after a week's break in August to celebrate the end of the month what the Fed will actually do. But of course there's more data between now and then as well. We get inflation data next Friday, and there's the September jobs report at the beginning of September as well. I do want to point as well to the weaker dollar, because that will also have an impact on our trading partners, and also other political news today. And it is political, is the stake in Intel. So the president just truthing out a few minutes ago this confirmation that he had reached this deal with Lip Bhutan, the CEO of Intel, a little earlier. He's talking about how the 10% government share is valued at roughly $11 billion. It's a very, very unorthodox deal. We haven't seen the government take a stake in a company since way back after the financial crisis, when it took stakes, obviously, in the mortgage lenders, the GSEs, Fannie and Freddie, and it's still in them, right? Now, we learned from Intel earlier that it's going to be a passive ownership stake. There won't be any board members, and the US government has agreed to vote with the company's board. Also, that the US will get a warrant for an additional 5% of Intel. So bear in mind, this is an almost 15% stake once it fully vests, assuming that it does. But again, the president very proud and truthing this out just a few minutes ago. So those shares were higher, as were the broader market today, falling off a little bit in the post-market as the market digests exactly what this means. And then just another little story for all of you Siri users out there. It looks like Apple is now exploring Google's Gemini to make Siri a little bit better. I know a lot of people that would be very happy about that, would like Siri to understand them a little bit better, but it's also in talks with others. So, for example, Anthropic and OpenAI. So, as our own reporter Mark Gurman called it earlier, it's a little bit of a bake-off, and it is obviously going to come down to cost and whose model works the best.
All right, a great roundup by Bloomberg's Vonnie Quinn from World Headquarters in New York. We thank you, as always. We turn now to overseas and the war in Ukraine, after President Trump told reporters this afternoon, while he's not happy about what's happening in the Russia-Ukraine talks, he's giving Russian President Vladimir Putin another 2-week deadline to come to the table.
No, I'm not happy about anything about that war. Nothing. Not happy at all. We'll see what happens. I think over the next 2 weeks, we're going to find out which way it's going to go. And I better be very happy.
And joining us now here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio with her analysis is Evelyn Farkas, Executive Director of Arizona State University's McKee Institute and former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia under the Obama administration. Evelyn, it's good to see you, and thanks for being here. We heard from the Ukrainian President Zelensky earlier today, who said that President Trump is, quote, currently the only person who can stop Putin. Can you put this into context for us here? Is that the right assessment? How much leverage does the U.S. president have when it comes to trying to get this war to end?
Yeah, I mean, Taylor, I would agree that President Trump is, if there's a single person who can put, well, if there's a single person who can put an end to the war, it is Vladimir Putin ultimately, because he's waging this war against Ukraine. Ukraine doesn't want a war. They would put down their weapons the minute, Russia really is willing to make peace. Having said that, short of Vladimir Putin, the next person with all the cards and all the influence to make this war end is President Trump. But of course, it requires us to put more pressure on the Kremlin. And that means sanctions, that means providing more weapons to Ukraine. And I'm glad to see that President Trump is threatening sanctions again. Although I will say I don't know why he's waiting 2 weeks, because President Putin has clearly been playing for time to get his troops more time on the battlefield. And that is not in the interest of the United States.
Evelyn, we have heard from Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov essentially that they have very little interest in a meeting right now. He was dismissive in an interview on NBC's Meet the Press that will air this weekend of the idea of a meeting between Vladimir Putin and Zelensky, yet Donald Trump is signaling that he'd be willing to give as much as 2 weeks to the Russian leader. Is that too much time? Should Donald Trump simply turn around now and say, look, it's time to move on sanctions?
Yes, and he should have turned around and done that, when the Russian president refused his ceasefire ultimatum, at that meeting in Alaska last Friday. So, I think our president is being way too lenient when it comes to Vladimir Putin. And we have all the power to make Vladimir Putin afraid, so afraid that when President Trump threatened sanctions before, Vladimir Putin said, oh, wait, don't sanction me. I'll come and meet you in Alaska. Well, he came to Alaska. Again, President Trump said, you need to give us a ceasefire and start negotiating in earnest. And President Putin said no, went away. And I guess maybe he gave President Trump the impression that he would meet with President Zelensky one-on-one. Those of us who know how Putin thinks and understand kind of the mentality, the ideology that's driving him, know that he does not view President Zelensky as his equal. He would never meet one-on-one with President Zelensky unless he was, defeated militarily by President Zelensky and President Trump insisted on it. So, unfortunately, I think the Russians have been misleading our president, and we really need to slap those sanctions on, as you said, Tyler, or Mike, rather, immediately.
And for our radio listeners, we're showing right now President Trump. He was in the Oval Office earlier today showing a picture of himself and Russian President Vladimir Putin. And one of the main threads that we've been following this week, Evelyn, of course, has been the idea of Europe and the U.S. trying to get something on paper when it comes to security guarantees. That really has been dominating the conversation. There seemed to be optimism at the start of the week, but now we've seen these roadblocks emerge, and our reporting indicates a lot of it is coming from Russia wanting to have a say in what Ukraine's security guarantees are going to look like. I know that you're talking about the U.S. giving perhaps more weapons and support here, but when it comes to long-term guarantees, what is realistic to expect? What do you think can actually get done that would get a deal over the finish line?
Well, that's a really good question, because what is the right thing to do, the smart thing to do, may not be realistic yet, Taylor. So at the moment, I can say the right thing to do is to, give an Article 5-like agreement to Ukraine. That means if Ukraine's invaded, the United States will come to its military defense in every way possible. And one better would be to, include Ukraine in NATO. They certainly have deserved it. They're now the largest, most capable European fighting power that exists because of this horrible war that's been thrust upon them. So they would actually be an asset inside NATO, and certainly it would be horrible if they were on the other side of the equation, if Russia conquered them. So, that would be the best case scenario. Unfortunately, the Russians, they sometimes seem to give President Trump the impression, I guess, maybe last week, they gave the impression that they would be willing to have European tripwire troops on Ukrainian territory. Now the Russians are saying no way. At the end of the day, the Ukrainians will want foreign troops to guarantee that peace. but they will also want that Article 5 guarantee, the guarantee that if they are attacked again by Russia, we will come to their direct military assistance. And this is the thing, that Ukraine, as much as they want to stop this war, they don't want to be reinvaded by Russia. And they don't want a ceasefire. That means that they have to be on alert, and they can't live as free people because Russia's going to invade again. And let me just say one other thing. China is watching. So this is not just about Ukraine and Europe. China's watching. And I am afraid that Vladimir Putin will try to distract, or China will try to distract, create more confusion by trying to attack Taiwan, or that Vladimir Putin will conduct some sort of lower level military action against a NATO ally.
Evelyn, I'm glad you brought up China, because next week Xi Jinping is hosting a meeting of the leaders of Russia, Turkey, and India. And when we talk about secondary sanctions, India and China loom as the largest targets for the U.S. if Donald Trump were to proceed in that direction. And yet doing so would be at odds with his goals on trade with those two economies.
Well, yeah, this is where it gets complicated. Putting more tariffs on China when it comes to purchase of oil and gas, could be problematic for the United States, because we're also trying to work out an overall tariff deal with China. We don't want a global trade war, and the stakes are very high when it comes to the United States and China. So, I think President Trump will have to weigh that in the balance. But frankly, I think if the Chinese are faced with that kind of a sanction, maybe they would put pressure on Russia to stop the war, to make a deal. That these are the kind of things that actually President Trump is equipped to assess, because he is willing to take on risk in a way that, is different from other presidents. And I give him credit for that, because he's not afraid to say, well, I may put sanctions on. And he put sanctions on, higher tariffs on India because they were continuing to buy oil from Russia, which was something no one foresaw.
Evelyn Farkas, Executive Director of Arizona State University's McCain Institute and former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia in the Obama administration, we thank you for your insight. Coming up, Ghislaine Maxwell's closed-door testimony to the Department of Justice is released to Congress. Plus, the FBI raid on former National Security Advisor John Bolton when we assemble our political panel next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Most fundamental bottom line thing is that we want America to win the global AI race. This has been one of the president's top priorities, and he wants to sort of unleash the animal spirits of American innovation in AI. He's made that very clear. But of course, my job as the consumer protection watchdog is just to make sure, as we unleash American innovation, consumers at least are being told, honestly, how AI products work, what they can do, what the consequences are.
This is Balance of Power, and that was FTC Chair Andrew Ferguson speaking to Bloomberg earlier today on the administration's approach to embracing and regulating artificial intelligence. You can find the whole interview online and on the terminal.
Now let's get to some of the other top stories that we're following in today's Power Brief.
A federal judge says that the sprawling immigrant detention camp located in the Florida Everglades was built without a proper environmental review and must be dismantled. State and federal officials have 60 days to remove the fencing, lighting, and other infrastructure installed to support the facility. The judge rejected an argument that the federal facility was exempt from review because it was built by the state of Florida, noting that the Trump administration had pledged $600 million in federal funding to support the initiative. A Florida state official filed a notice of appeal.
Plus, NVIDIA is instructing component suppliers to stop production related to the H20 artificial intelligence chip. According to a report from The Information, the order comes after Beijing urged local companies to avoid using H20 chips, which were originally designed specifically for the Chinese market. NVIDIA and competitor AMD both recently secured Washington's approval to resume lower-end AI chip sales to China, but only on the condition that they give the U.S. government 15% of the related revenue. Bloomberg has not independently confirmed this report.
And FBI agents raided the home of President Donald Trump's former National Security Advisor John Bolton early this morning, a sign the White House is stepping up a campaign of retribution against some of its fiercest critics. A source tells Bloomberg the search is linked to an investigation into whether Bolton retained or shared classified documents. President Trump addressed the raid earlier today.
I'm not a fan of John Bolton. He's a real sort of a lowlife. He's not a smart guy, but he could be a very unpatriotic guy. I mean, we're going to find out.
During Trump's first term, prosecutors investigated Bolton over his Tell-All 2020 memoir, which detailed Bolton's belief that Trump was unfit for the presidency. Trump accused Bolton of using classified information in the book and sued unsuccessfully to block its publication.
And joining us now with their reaction to this story and more is this evening's political panel, Bloomberg Politics contributor and Democratic analyst Jeannie Sheehan Zaino, Democracy Visiting Fellow at Harvard Kennedy School's Asht Center, alongside Republican strategist Matt Terrell, Managing Partner at Firehouse Strategies. Let's just start here with this latest story when it comes to the FBI raid against Bolton. And Jeannie, we actually had a very interesting conversation about this on the early edition of Balance of Power, and I would love to get your thoughts again. What's your level of concern when it comes to this raid?
You know, it is concerning, but I think we should all just take a breath and wait, because in this case, this is not just the executive branch going in or directing the DOJ to go in. This is a judge who signed off on an affidavit and was convinced that there was enough evidence or enough potentially probable cause to go in and to conduct a search. And so given that, I think we should take a hands-off approach and wait and see if and what they find. That said, Tyler, the timing is interesting. Coming on the same day that Congress gets the Epstein files, the DOJ decided at the very time that those are released in the transcripts that they would go in and do this. So the timing is interesting, but I would hold off on judgment till we see what they found.
Matt, are you holding off on judgment on this? What is your take on this raid of the Bolton residence? Do you see it as part of a pursuit by the president against some of his adversaries, including in his own party and his own former allies like John Bolton?
Well, look, I think it is good to see the president say that he was unaware of this raid, didn't know it was going to happen. But look, the reality is I think many in the Make It movement for sure recognize that President Trump had his home raided. And now they're seeing this happen with Ambassador Bolton. And look, there's no question there's more information we need to find out on this, but there were judges that signed off on this. This wasn't just the president going in and saying, this is me doing this. Judges signed off on doing this, and we'll have to just wait and see where all the information lies on this.
Jeannie, I'd like to turn to you next on a different topic, and this is one that maybe Matt can address as well, and that is the president's announcement this afternoon on an investment by the U.S. government in Intel. Yesterday in this room and earlier today, we heard from Mike Pence and Lael Brainerd, each expressing reservations and concern about the U.S. government taking this kind of role in industrial policy. What is your take? Is this a good idea? And what sort of precedent are we setting here, if any?
You know, it is so stunning to me that the Republican Party that has long talked about the freedom to conduct business unencumbered by the government, has long supported free trade and the like, is now in a position not only of moving away from its traditional trade policies, but also taking the biggest stake we've ever seen in a company like this. It just heralds to me a new day in what it means to be a Republican, at least in this current iteration of the Republican Party. So I have enormous concerns about that. And you can just go through the litany of concerns, but at the top of them is the concern that what does this mean about innovation? And what does it mean as it impacts national security? Those two things weigh heavily. So I agree with Mike Pence, and I seldom say that, Mike Shepard, but I agree it is a concerning change.
So, Matt, what's your take here when we have seen this trend from the administration of a perhaps more hands-on industrial policy, not just with Intel, but the so-called golden share when we think about the Nippon deal? And you hear White House officials saying that perhaps this is the push that they need to do in order to accomplish their industrial policies, reshoring manufacturing, things like that.
Well, it's not the first time that the United States has made an investment in a company. That's happened before, happened in 2008, for example. But look, this does map with the president's strategy of trying to onshore opportunity here in the United States. Take, for example, production of semiconductors and chips. A lot of that obviously taking shape and being produced in Taiwan. Wanting to get that produced here in the United States. Part of that's economic opportunity. Part of it's just national security. But the other side of this is, look, what we're talking about here is building off of the grants that are, taxpayer-funded grants that are provided under the Biden administration to this company. And I think a lot of Americans look at this and say, why were we providing taxpayer-funded grants to a company that's worth billions of dollars? You're giving billions of dollars of grants into a company that's worth billions of dollars. And so this is also an opportunity for the United States to get economic opportunity out of this, to get equity out of this, to get a return on their investment as taxpayers. So part of it's a strategy of what you just outlined, but another part of it, I think, is a philosophy that many people are going to rally behind on the use of taxpayer funds and Washington in general on that.
Jeannie, I wanted to turn to a different story that we've been following really all year, but especially this week, and that is the question of Fed independence in the light of the pressure campaign on Fed Chair Jerome Powell to lower rates. And this week, of course, the calls for Fed Governor Lisa Cook to resign. Have we gone past the point of no return when it comes to politicizing the central bank and challenging its independence?
I really hope not. Sometimes it's hard to put that genie back in the bottle, and I think that's a concern for most of us because the independence of the Fed is critical, and we've seen it in other countries, and we see it here. And so we should have an independent Fed. I was struck by the fact that Jerome Powell today in his remarks didn't even go there beyond saying that they would continue to follow the data and make decisions based on the data, because we haven't seen the Fed, at least in my lifetime, under this much political pressure. And of course, we want an independent Fed because Republicans have to remember, if it is not independent, it's going to be Democrats pushing it as well. All presidents want lower interest rates and want to have control of the Fed.
Sorry to do this. Only 15 seconds here, really, Matt. Should the president be pressuring the Fed?
Well, look, it's his right to do what he's doing. He's got the right to go out and vocally express how he feels, and he believes that you got to get these rates down. Bottom line is you saw the market rally today, surge today, with the notion that there may be rate cuts on the way. President Trump has a big economic agenda that he wants to fulfill. Part of that is hoping that these rate cuts come down. We'll see what happens.
Jeannie Shanzano and Matt Terrell, thank you both. And a programming note, make sure to tune into a brand new Wall Street Week with Bloomberg's David Weston. That's coming up at 6 p.m. Eastern right here on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Thanks for joining us on this edition of Balance of Power. Alongside Michael Shepard, I'm Tyler Kendall. This is Bloomberg. We'll see you back here on Monday.